Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Honored to have Admiral Blair here today, who is a member of the Naval Academy class of '68. A very distinguished class, and I don't know what was in the water in Annapolis during the plebe summer of 1964, but I hope the class of '23, can get a sip of that. So, I'm ready to jump right into it, sir. To start the conversation, can you briefly summarize the events in East Asia that have brought us to this state of intense competition and talk of war between the U.S. and China?
I think it's good to start with an overview, and of course, General Tyson Thomas gave us very impressive cliff notes on how Taiwan and China got to be where they are. And let me just widen the lens a little bit. For the 30 years after the end of World War II, East Asia was a violent, chaotic, brutal place. It was a combination of the collapse of the short-lived Japanese Empire, result of World War II, the Chinese Civil War, which had started before that war and was to continue until 1949, the end of colonialism, European colonialism throughout Asia, from Southeast Asia up to the north, and then finally the start of the Cold War. And this really consumed virtually all of East Asia in fighting and suffering and dying, and no progress on virtually any front except sort of sorting out the countries that would be standing. And during that time, the United States and China were involved in two wars. The first one, Chinese troops and American troops actually fought each other on the Korean Peninsula, and in the second one in Vietnam, American troops going against Chinese-backed and supplied and sometimes aided North Vietnamese troops. So this era finally came to an end with the American withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, and at that point, Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia, not only was stabilized from a point of view of political boundaries and settling, either the old scores were settled or else they were chill-shocked, as on the Korean Peninsula, as in areas in Southeast Asia. And then, starting from about 1975, came an extraordinary period of economic and political growth in that same part of the world that really started very quickly and just gained incredible exponential force. A series of East Asian countries found the magic formula of reforming their agricultural sector, accumulating capital, going into manufacturing, trading with the developed world, chiefly the United States, but also other countries, raising the standard of living throughout the country, bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. This path was blazed by Japan, which was under U.S. occupation right after the war, followed by Korea, followed by Taiwan, and even carried on up until countries like Indonesia and Thailand and many other countries in Southeast Asia followed this same incredibly positive path after a really bloody 3 decades following the war. And starting in 1989, China went along the same, by this time, well-worn path of how you develop your economy, raise the standard of living, bring your people out of poverty. So just an incredible success story in Asia, starting after 1975. Along with this economic development came, in many countries, political development. There were some tough, nasty, autocratic regimes in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Indonesia. And as these countries developed economically, they also developed politically, and the direction of the development was towards more representative, democratic, not a European model, not an American model, a different model, but including the basic ideas of people electing their governments, replacing governments peacefully, institutions being developed that protected the rights of minorities, and in many cases, multi-ethnic countries. And we saw a series of countries become not only prosperous, but democratic. The United States and China had resumed relations in 1979 after an opening in 1972. The opening in 1972 was, on the American side, much more of a my enemy's enemy is my friend, and in order to be in a stronger position to deal with the Soviet Union, we should have better relations with China. On the Chinese side, there was some of that geostrategic motion, but there was also, having observed how engagement with the American economy and other Western economies had benefited those countries, there was this idea that China could follow the same path of economic development, and relations with the United States were an important part of that. So that went through 1972, 1979. Mao Zedong finally died, leaving the scenes after blessing his country with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which did more damage than any of the wars that they were involved in. And his successor, Deng Xiaoping, put China on this same path that had been blazed by other smaller countries. And China overachieved on the same path. I mean, higher levels of development, sustained for longer times, bringing more people out. And if you read the history of it, as you look back, it looks sort of inevitable. Well, of course they developed, when they were open, but there was a very many tough decisions that were made along the way that Chinese leaders made to bring China up. When I was the Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, right around the year 2000, China was on this journey economically. It was beginning to also develop militarily. And in its relations with the United States, or in the United States' relations with China, the United States adopted a really hedged two-part strategy to very much engage and include China in the global economic order, highlighted by China joining the WTO, which President Clinton very much favored and fostered, and then was confirmed under the Bush administration. And the hopeful idea that, or the best case, that, as had many other Asian countries, political development would follow economic development. Those hopes were given a big step backward in Tiananmen Square incident, but at the same time that the United States was pursuing this positive strategy, the United States recognized that China might not turn out that way, and that in order to deal with a China which decided to become both rich and aggressive rather than rich and democratic, the United States needed to keep the basis of its security position in Asia, which are primarily its military capability and its alliances in the region. I think you could make the argument that the issue is still undecided in China up through maybe 2010 or so, but from about 2010, a little bit later on, and particularly with the arrival of Xi Jinping in 2012, it was pretty clear that China felt that having become such a powerful economic force, both in Asia and in the world, having resources to allocate to military development and double-digit military budget increases over now 20 20 years, surpassing Japan in GDP as the second largest economy in the world. China felt, we're number 2. And in Asia, we're number 1. And there ought to be, in the sort of Chinese way of thinking about power relationships, a certain deference to China by all of the countries around us and by the United States. And if we project these trends to continue, pretty soon we'll pass the United States too, move into the position of preeminence, first in East Asia, maybe more widely as we determine, as more globally as things develop. And we will just simply become the most powerful country in Asia to which other countries will develop, and places like our remaining border dispute with Russia, with India, a little bit with Vietnam, our big core interest of Taiwan will fall into place as a natural course of things. The United States, for its part, said, well, that good optimistic plan that we're following up through about 2010 or so doesn't look like it's playing out. Time to turn to the backup plan, and the backup plan basically involved increasing our own military force, strengthening our alliance so that aggression would not be attractive to China, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And it was covered in the first panel very, very effectively. And in the economic competition and in the competition for political systems, who has the better system, a democratic system or a state-directed political and capital system? We're just going to have to buckle up and compete with China in that area. So that's sort of how we got to where we are, and there's a lot of work still to do.
Oh yeah, thank you, sir. Keeping on theme with what you just touched on, your successor, at Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, in his final testimony before Congress, stated that China might seek to invade Taiwan in the next 6 years. Do you agree with this window?
No. Phil Davidson was right to draw attention to increasing Chinese military power, to a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of China. But I thought, again, General Tyson Thomas gave a very eloquent description of the difficulty of crossing the Taiwan Strait and actually taking and holding Taiwan. From the Chinese point of view, what they have to do if they decide to move militarily is be successful very quickly, present the rest of the world with a fait accompli, done deal, we occupy Taiwan, and then sort of hunker down and weather through the inevitable sanctions and global reactions, the kind they faced themselves in Tiananmen Square after '89, the kinds that we see that the international community is placing against Russia now, and that after a while, the world will say, second biggest country in the world, huge trading partner for everybody, looks like it's done now, let's get back to normal business. That was sort of the strategy after Tiananmen Square. It worked after that time, and that's their ideal. If things don't happen quickly, if scenarios are protracted in terms of conflict or in terms of declared or undeclared war, things get bad for China. Chinese leadership has placed so much of their credibility on this sacred mission of reunifying China, and again, I thought General Tyson Thomas gave a very good example, a very good analysis of why they feel that way. If they don't succeed, it threatens the very reason that people of China should put up with giving away their rights, giving away their freedom to this government, which can't even fulfill this idea of taking over this little island off of its coast. So the risks are not just that the Chinese administration would be voted out of office, which are generally the penalty that a government and a democracy pays if they don't do very well on national security policy. This could weaken the entire hold of the Communist Party on power in China. And I think despite the articles and speeches by retired military officers in China on the internet, Chinese leaders are in fact very conservative about whether they would take this very risky step with an untried armed forces that the last time it went to war in a serious way against Vietnam in 1979 basically lost. And I think they have come to the conclusion in the past and will continue to come to the conclusion over the next 6 years that this is just too risky. Let's not make a bold military move. Let's work away on building our economy, becoming so powerful economically that people will recognize our power and will make the concessions that we think we need. So that's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's something we have to work on. But I sort of, don't see a real window of vulnerability here real soon.
Thank you, sir. Turning to our allies in the region, specifically with Japan, where do you see the U.S.-Japan alliance going in the future, and what interoperability capabilities should we be looking to improve and or capitalize on here in the future?
Yeah, I think the developments in Japan are really the underreported story in the Asian security landscape. And it's all due to the growing Chinese threat. During this period that I talked about, when the United States pursued this dual strategy, I would hear from Japanese friends, you Americans just don't understand. China is not going to develop politically, not going to develop democratically. We just have to count on strong military deterrent defensive capability, and you Americans are dreaming. It was in fact called a perception gap. That was the word that the Japanese used. As I said, after about 2012 or so, there is no perception gap between the United States and Japan on the potential aggressive nature, economic, diplomatic, military, and potentially military threat that China faces. And Japan has reacted to this. So as opposed to the past where the old idea of U.S. armed forces deployed in the Western Pacific being the spear and Japan being the shield, now Japan is a much more equal partner in a common set of security concerns in that part of the world. And this has been, again, there's nothing like an aggressive neighbor to really do the things that you can't do with an ally by trying to persuade them. When in 2012, there was a nasty incident around the Senkaku Islands, which are claimed by both China and Japan. Japan really awoke to this idea of disputed territory with China. The United States had been long concerned, as was explained in an earlier panel about the ambiguous independence of Taiwan. So now Japan had very territorial skin in the game, with China claiming this set of islands, which Japan also historically claimed. So Japan thinking, again, working on how would we defend this if China actually were to make a move. And it turns out, from a military point of view, the things you would have to do to make it difficult, tough, and expensive for China to take over the Senkaku Islands are the same sorts of things that you would have to do to support Taiwan should the United States decide to support it. And Japan realized there's a piece of Japanese territory which lies only 70 kilometers north of Taiwan. So it's almost impossible to think of conflict in Taiwan that does not involve Japanese territory as well as Japanese interests. So Japan has really now feels a threat. This growing feeling of threat has overcome Japan's laudable in many ways and traditional idea that outlaws war as an instrument of international relations as specified in their constitution written for them by a group of American lawyers in 1946. And Japan is thinking in more traditional security terms. Prime Minister Abe, whose funeral will take place next week, longest serving Japanese prime minister in history, very much felt this way and was building this more stronger security Japanese attitude. His successor has followed it. Japan has broken several taboos, like the 1% of GDP traditional limit on their defense spending, like considering revising their constitution to put their armed forces on a more legal basis within the country rather than calling them self-defense forces and twisting them into gyrations about what operations they cannot and can't do. So Japan is really increasing its military capability, its political system to be able to defend itself and work with the United States. And so if you put the combination of American military and economic power and Japanese military and economic power, the first and third GDPs in the world, China being the second, then the long-term ability for military action to be very unattractive for China is much increased. And that was what I always felt when I was the military commander out there, is the less we talk about shooting and the more we talk about competing and cooperating in a business point of view, the better it is for the region, as shown by those 40 magic years of Asian economic improvement from 75 through really to the present.
So you were just touching on the economy. China's growth in the recent past has been very impressive, leading to many straight-line predictions that it will surpass the United States as the world's largest economy and become the most powerful country in Asia and even the world. Do you see this prediction holding true or no?
Yeah, I don't. I was never that impressed by just looking at two lines of GDP development and then extending them both in a straight line and saying, okay, it's 2035 when China will surpass the United States. They already surpass in purchasing power parity, and it will be in exchange-rated GDP a few years later. All of this stuff was I thought pretty simplistic, and I think we are seeing and if you read the history of Chinese economic development, as you turn around and look backwards, it said, wow, of course they did that. Very, very simple. They just follow the same playbook that Korea, Taiwan, Japan played off. And it wasn't that simple. It was a series of very tough decisions with different factions, with different power bases within China. And that's continuing. And right now, the biggest fault line in the Chinese economy is that between their private sector and their state-owned enterprise sector. The economic analysis, both by outside economists and by those in China who always talk to the outside experts, it's funny how they are, is that the private sector is where China has generated the growth, generated the jobs. The companies that are internationally competitive, Ant, ByteDance, TikTok, are all private sector companies. And right now, for reasons of consolidating political power, the Xi government is clamping down on the private sector, killing the goose that lays the golden egg, and putting emphasis on the state-owned enterprises, which they can control more directly, which in fact are consuming capital. You'd be better putting your money under a mattress than investing it in most of these nationalized Chinese companies. So on a fundamental economic basis, I think they're running into real headwinds and will have a hard time getting through them. And that's even before the actions that the United States and other countries are taking now to pull investment out of China, to get supply chains going through other parts of the country. So I think those old straight line projections are just being completely redone, and they're being redone to lower Chinese growth, and we'll see how the United States does.
Thank you, sir. A previous panel has touched on this, but what do you think the lessons that China is drawing from the war in Ukraine, and what do you think the United States is seeing in response to that, and also lessons there we are learning as well?
We've heard that from two previous panels, so I won't go over the ground. I would just add one thing. Wars are really easy to start and really tough to end. And I think that the United States has relearned that lesson, and a few of the adventures that we've tried recently. Russia is learning it now, and I think that sensible Chinese leaders who listen to glossy PowerPoint briefings from the People's Liberation Army, how we can wrap this thing up in a few days, and then we'll withstand sanctions for a few months, and then we'll be back to business, are probably rethinking it.
Sure.
Do we need to go to foreign? Do we need to go to?
We got one more question, and then
what's the deal? One more.
One more question. We'll go to
Good.
questions.
Good. Yep.
Back to the economy side of things, sir. China makes no secret of its ambition to dominate the advanced technologies of the future, from AI to electric vehicles and robotics. The United States has responded, however, with industrial policy of its own. How will this competition play out in the near future and the long future?
I mean, I'd bet on the messy but incredibly energetic and innovative, more capitalist, market-driven system of the United States than I would bet on being able to outguess these technologies of the future and saying, this is what we need to do, so if we put all resources into it, we'll be the king of AI, we'll be the king of 6G, we'll be the king of robotics. Information and communications technology is really the fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution that's still driving things. And I defy you to find somebody who 10 years ago predicted exactly what would work. Remember, satellite phones completely lost out to cellular phones 20 years ago when Motorola's Iridium constellation was launched for a $20 billion bet and was a few years later sold for about $1 billion because cell phones went through walls and satellite phones didn't. That's dead, satellite phones. Now we have Elon Musk and Starlink and all of the Raya and all of the other things coming up, and we're sort of back to satellite phones. So the idea that a group of government bureaucrats can say, this is the form that 5G Wi-Fi will take in the future, and therefore, if we freeze the specifications for 5G, put all our base stations all over China, develop huge projects, they will be bought by the rest of the world. I think that's simply not going to be true. I think you need a lot more flexibility with regard to the very areas that China has singled out as the most important areas. It's not like the 1970s when it was clear that Japan could make better consumer electronics, better automobiles, better ships. These were known established markets which they were able to apply their doctrines of continuous improvements to and grab big market share. These are areas in which the technology is just not going to settle down. And so I would bet for the more freewheeling technology-based, all contingent upon if we can just get our damn politics together in this country and stop moving to the extremes and spending all this time shooting at each other across the political divide on issues rather than trying to get together to solve the important things of our aging infrastructure, our immigration policy, our debt, our social security system. If we can handle all that on a political point of view, I have great faith in our economic potential compared to China's.
Well, I'm sure we all appreciate your optimism, sir. And I guess with that, we'll turn to some audience questions. If there's any in there. I see one back there.
John Bernowski, just a regular citizen. From what I've heard, it seems like China's
I'm sorry,
effort-
sir, could you stand a little closer to the
Oh,
mic?
is this better?
That's better.
Okay, I'm sorry. From what I've heard, it sounds like you think China's efforts to expand its hegemony in Asia and probably Africa aren't all that successful. But do you think if the world came to a conflict between the United States and China, that some Asian countries might be forced to ally with China versus America? Does that make sense?
Right, I understand. If there is a conflict between the United States and China, I don't think it will be a big war on every front war. I think it'll be confined to a geographic region in the area of northernmost limit of which would be the Senkaku Islands. Southernmost area would be the South China Sea. I think it will be a confined area. I think it will be to the advantage of both sides to try to contain it, both in space and in intensity. And I think that the way that countries line up on it will be partly determined by the economic relations they have with the United States compared to China, but also will be based on how it starts, which I think is certainly a large part of the reason for the reaction that we've seen to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It just seemed completely unprovoked type of aggression that the rest of the world ought to stand up for. Some of the world hiding behind others in the world in that response, but nonetheless with that popular feeling about it. And so it kind of depends how it starts. If it is naked Chinese aggression, I've been saying Taiwan's a part of China for 75 years now. I'm just going to take it. Seems to me you get one kind of a reaction. If it's Taiwan seeming to provoke Chinese reaction by trying to insist on de jure independence as well as de facto independence, then I think you get a little more of a reaction. Well, you live 70 miles from a big tiger and you go poke him in the side and say, there. I think will be another reaction. So I think I think there's a range of possibilities there, and it'll play out depending on that set of factors.
Thank you.
We have an online question from Caroline, and it speaks about the evolution of Pacific Command to Indo-PACOM. Can you talk a little bit about the role of India?
The role of India?
Yes.
I'm not really a good one to ask about India because, frankly, I'm a little cynical about this rhetoric that says the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy, and that should form a union which we all kind of do the same thing together. My experience is that Indian policy is probably the most clear-eyed realpolitik. I'm surprised Bismarck was not an Indian. There's got to be some Indian blood in there somewhere, or vice versa. All my dealings with the Indians had almost zero ideological content, and were all in terms of, well, let's see, this is to our advantage to do this, not to do that. Indians are masters of doing the right thing, but hiding it behind different rhetoric. In the United States, we can't stand not to have our rhetoric match our actions. If we're doing something in one way, we talk about it. And so I think there's a limited, all that to say that I think that there's a limited area of cooperation possible between the United States and India. I think most of it's economic. On a military security point of view, I don't think we get too much further than what most administrations have thought, is that an independent, prosperous, powerful India is probably a good thing for offsetting China just by its existence. But the idea of some sort of American Indian. So you've probably been taught in all your IR classes about the Quad, and my expectations of the Quad are pretty minimal, I will have to tell you. And any organization that puts out, every communique that the Quad has put out, no communique that the Quad has put out has mentioned the word China to date. And yet, every article written about the Quad says this is a contained China policy. Well, eventually you got to get those two squared up. So I think India will be following India's interests. We follow our interests, and sometimes they match up. But the idea of turning that into something bigger, as many administrations have said, it's a little bit of Lucy in the football. You know, administration after administration has run up to that football, and India Lucy has just pulled it away when Charlie Brown swung his foot. And I think we'll see a lot more of that.
Thank you. We probably have time for about 2 more questions. So I know I saw that hand back there for a while.
You have to wait till the mic is so the people online can hear.
Sorry to make you run all the way over there.
Robert Stanovich again. I am a student from Goodman College, if I didn't mention that earlier. You mentioned the problems with projection with China's economic problems, prospects. Has any of those models taken into consideration the long-term effects of the one-child policy? You have all these Chinese males unable to reproduce themselves because there's not enough fish in the sea.
Yes, I didn't get to that in my list of headwinds that China is facing, but the fact that their working age population peaked about 5 years ago and is in fact going down is ultimately going to be another drag on their economic performance. And as you probably know, since you asked the question, although there is no longer a formal one-child policy, in fact, there is now a policy of trying to encourage more than one child, as is true in many wealthy countries or semi-wealthy countries. Parents simply don't want to have more than one child, and despite China changing that policy, the demographics are not exploding the way Chinese leaders hoped when they ended the policy. So again, most GDP growth models depend on productivity per worker, and when your denominator is going down, as has happened in Japan, Italy, many other countries, you have to fill that in with capital, and that's a pretty absorbing economic challenge.
Thank you. There's one back there.
Morning, Admiral. First Class Joshua Orbe, Philippine Coast Guard, on loan to the Coast Guard Academy. As both a naval officer and a member of Freedom House, what do you see in the future of the Philippines as an ally and democracy with the return to the Marcos family to power?
Yeah, I mean, one more round of the 40 families in the Philippines continuing to own the place, right? They just trade the jobs around among the families. Aquino, Marcos, you know all the names, and until the Philippines can break out of that, get a real reformer, and the one president who was not one of those 40 families, it wasn't a very pretty experience with Duterte, was it in the past? So I mean, when Duterte was elected, I thought that was, in the beginning, I thought it was terrific. Here's a man from the South, not part of the Luzon elite, going to change the neglect of Mindanao and change basic policies, and you know, he turned out to be the wrong person there. So Philippines has got to find a non-Marcos, non-Aquino, the other 37 families, who, 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 37 does the right thing. Now, I thought the best president of the Philippines in recent years was General Ramos. I thought he did an excellent job and was really trying to take his country in the right direction and build institutions that were not dependent on patronage and family ties and so on. And when he, a bunch of us told him, Fidel, you gotta run for a second term. You did great things for your one term, but why don't you ask the people if they want you to do that for another 4 years? And he, to his credit, he said, no, our Constitution says one president, one term. I'm not going to take that move to what looks like a long-serving dictator. So he left, and there's been nobody like him to try to move the country in that direction. So I think definitely unfinished business for the Philippines to recognize the potential that we see from the Philippine people whenever they are in situations in which they aren't squashed by this patronage-based family. They produced amazing things in work and art and culture and all sorts of areas. So the potential is there. The government has just got to be worthy of the people, and it's not yet.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question. If there's right there in the middle.
Hi, my name is Logan Furman. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I was just curious. With the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen the U.S. start to pull out of trading with China a little bit, and even not just that, but even in the past few years, we've seen that. Do you think we'll ever really? I mean, I'm not saying I want this to happen, but do you think we'll ever reach a point where the U.S. just says, "Hey, we don't want to trade with China anymore"?
I don't think it'll really reach that decoupled autarkic system that we had, for instance, with the Warsaw Pact versus NATO, when there was virtually no trade across it. I think what both countries want to do is to avoid giving the other country economic leverage over them. So for their part, China saw what the U.S. government did to Huawei, the largest 5G and mobile phone maker in the world, and by denying American chips to Huawei, we basically have knocked that country out of, or that company out of its position in the international 5G market. China has tried to use its economic power, not so much against the United States, but certainly strongly against other countries, Australia, the Philippines, Norway, and Lithuania, and other countries that displease it, and Korea, of course. And sometimes that has been successful. Other times I just antagonized that country and said, "That's the best you got, China. We're doing it." So that's sort of all being played out. I think where this thing will settle is that both countries will pull apart, but leave a part of their supply chains and investment flows running through the other country, but they will limit that 10, 15, 20%, not the 90% of chips that China would use that were designed and tested in the United States, not the 95% of anodes and cathodes, which are manufactured in China and then are put together in assembly plants in the United States to form EVs. I think we'll pull apart till there's sort of a manageable part of supply chains running through the other country, and then we'll proceed like that for a while. It'll be less efficient. All the economists tell you that, but it'll have higher security quotient, be more robust against geopolitical events, and then it'll kind of depend on how the overall geostrategic relationship goes between the countries as to whether our relation, which way that economic relation goes in the future. So stay tuned.
Well, thank you, sir. I think we're out of time, but we all appreciate your time and your thoughts and your insights. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pardon?